God of Trash, Cultivation LitRPG, by author Noct chapter 134 to 141. They opened the next morning, spreading a grand opening banner made of scrap fabric, which one of the mages good with a brush and with decent handwriting had fixed up nicely. Snack Shop was blazoned on their shop's signboard, under an image of delicious fries in an iconic red holder that Reese definitely hadn't stolen from a certain clown back home. He'd wanted to make it fully iconic, with a moist soft drink cup sitting behind the fries, but his artist had gotten lost when he'd tried to explain what he wanted, then spent 10 minutes explaining to him that making something appear wet required a great deal of mastery with a brush, mastery that they, as someone who painted for fun and didn't pursue art seriously, did not have, and so he'd settled for piping hot delicious fries instead. They didn't hide inside their storefront, either, but stood out front. Reese had appointed the two cutest, one male, one female, and gotten them good wigs and decent makeup, and they served as the face of the shop, with a brightly colored umbrella shading their semi-mobile trash-cobbled snack stand and fresh fries boiling in oil. At first, the mages and mortals passed them by, but as the fries finished cooking, and beautiful golden potato slices sat gleaming under the sun, a few came by to check them out. When they stopped by, they were also offered chips and a free soda trial. Currently, Reese still wanted to run that one through taste testing before he worked on giving it an ephemeral healing effect, and he wasn't satisfied with his small-scale sample of people who were likely biased toward pleasing him. Reese had stopped by the farm and picked up fresh potatoes, and he and the other mages were hard at work in the back, cutting, slicing, and preparing the fries and fresh chips, with Reese mostly working on imbuing them with various magical effects, at whatever low level he could manage without other mages outright realizing what he was up to. As time ticked on, their sales ticked up. Things went slower than at the tournament, but that was to be expected. The tournament had been a profitable gathering of people without many resources prepared to refresh them, whereas this was a city, where people doubtlessly had their own ways of acquiring foodstuffs, and his snack shack was but another method of finding food. It was the difference between having a captive audience, and an audience he shared with a great deal of other shops. Of course he'd be moving product more slowly. One student in a bright white uniform swung by. He looked down on the shabby shop and scoffed, then derisively tossed them a coin and took some fries, ignoring the proffered free drink. He didn't stop or slow, but tossed a few in his mouth as he walked away. His feet stuttered. He slowed for a step, stunned. For a moment, he shuddered, then glanced over his shoulder and hurried off without another word. Reese raised his brows. Hopefully that's good. Noon hit, with the sun directly overhead. The shack out front ran low, and Mouse ran the freshly cut fries out. She scurried back with a traumatized expression on her face, and shot Reese a terrified look. They're coming. Reese stepped forward, concerned, and peered out the window. A line of white-coated students marched toward the stall. He tensed, hiding his aura, but tightly gripping his broken sword. That many students. Had they been discovered? If he had to, he'd fight with everything he got to make sure everyone else got out. The students approached, the haughty boy at their lead, and mobbed the stand. One order. I'll take two. I just want a bottle of that red sauce. 3 bags of chips, please. The shop's faces were almost instantly overwhelmed by orders. Reese pushed out a few more people to go help out front, hurriedly tugging wings on their heads on their way out the door. When they were gone, he turned to the rest of the mages. We've got to double production. Wash, peel, cut, soak, in double time. Go, go, go. A smattering of salutes answered him, and they rushed back to their stations. Hands blurred, sweat ran down brows. Even Reese, used to the rush, was pushed to his limit as a seemingly endless stream of students clamored for more, more, more. Their ketchup stocks ran low, and he had to cut off students from buying bottles, reserving it as a topping for those who bought fries alone. The potato chips flew off the shelves, and before long, the bags the mages had painstakingly built up ran low, too. By the end of the lunch rush, they were down to the dregs of potatoes, the dregs of ketchup, the dregs of bagged chips. Soda had run out long ago, to rave reviews, and Reese made a mental note to ramp up production, add a mild healing component, and start selling. As the lunch rush died down, all the mages slumped at their stations, exhausted. Reese clapped. The dinner rush is just around the corner. Come on, we need to prepare before it begins. The mages' eyes dimmed. He could sense it without speaking to anyone, the morale in the room was low. Reese glanced outside, then gestured the outdoors workers in. In the gap between lunch and dinner, no one purchased anything, not even snacks. With all his mages arrayed before him, he crossed his arms and looked down on them. What are we doing? Selling chips? One mage asked. Reese shook his head. Try again. Raising money for the insurgency. Another mage asked quietly. Reese shook his head once more. No. What are we doing? An exasperated Blake burst out, frustrated. A grin on his face, Reese snapped his fingers and pointed at Blake. We are the insurgency. That food we sold today, do you think it was just food? Yes. Anyone? A few mages raised their hands. Reese swept his hand out, as if to cut their hands down. No. It was poison. Poison that will corrupt their bodies and souls alike. Every bite is soaked in subtle impurities, full of a poison that will eat away at them without realizing. The Empire's next generation, the pride of their academy. All infected, blighted, brought low by impurities. And we will spread it further. To the next town. To the next academy. Until the entire empire is united by a chain of snack shops, all selling the same insidious illness. All snatching the empire's richness, health, and value from its very heart, from within. We will strike. No, we have struck, he said, making eye contact with Lyra. But while we are based in this city, we bear a crucial weakness, our location. They can find us and crush us with ease. What, then, when we operate snack shops in a dozen cities? When we own the hearts and minds of half the empire's citizens, and a logistics chain that allows us to strike anywhere, anywhen, when we can not only attack, but strike with blinding speed on any city, any camp, any location we please, and vanish once more, with no sign of our passing. Think, then, of what we will have in our hands. Reese held his up, and clenched it shut. Victory. In the front row, a female mage's brow furrowed. She raised her hand. This plan you speak of, won't it take decades, if not longer? We're mages. We have the time, Reese said confidently, settling back. His eyes flashed. How many times had he seen a trashy villain execute their plan too early, when they could simply outwait the hero? An immortal lich who moved during the human hero's lifespan, instead of going back to sleep for a century. An ancient vampire, who needed to kidnap the hero's sister while the hero was young and powerful, instead of waiting a decade or two for the human to grow old and decrepit. An immensely powerful force from beyond the universe, who simply had to creep onto the scene during the human hero's ephemeral youth. They were mages. They had time. He would not become the not long enough villain. No. He was patient. He could wait. What about the mages in camps? A male mage protested. I already have plans to free them. It will be a continual effort, but one that will grow easier with time, Reese assured him. Doubtlessly the Empire was already putting together a strike force against those who broke into camps, and he had no doubt that it would continue to grow stronger as long as he kept striking camps, but he had the initiative. And beyond that, he, too, could get stronger. In fact, it was a long ways off, but ultimately, the insurgency would split into two. Those who ran the shops, and did no evil, and those who did not but evil, in the Empire's eyes, while using the shops as refresh locations and traveling spots. Another mage raised his hand. What about taxes? Reese opened his mouth, then shut it. For the first time, his expression flagged, and his hand lowered. He hadn't thought about taxes at all. Taxes. Taxes. The bane of Al Capone, one of the greatest criminal minds in recent history. He couldn't overlook taxes. A second later, he beamed and pointed at that mage. What an excellent point. Can I trust you to look into that? Without waiting for the man's response, he moved on to the next question. Ah, the power of delegation. The questions settled down from there. The exhaustion faded from the mage's eyes, replaced by a sense of purpose and a deep resolve to overthrow the empire. This, too, was but a stepping stone toward domination of the empire, but a small, incremental step toward their eventual victory. They turned back to the produce as men and women changed. They didn't cut potatoes, they created the poison that they would inject directly into the empire's veins. No, that they fooled the empire into taking itself. Rhys looked over them with a smile before turning back to his own small role in this whole process. The dinner rush went well, if it was quieter and more dominated by working mages than the military students, and then they closed up shop for the night. Rhys kindly let the tired mages rest in the upstairs section of the building, where guests might have once shared the large, long attic for the night, back when this was a tavern, though with the promise that they'd all have to break and run for supplies at dawn. For his part, Rhys bumbled around the kitchen cleaning up while everyone else vanished upstairs, until it was only him alone in the room. Only then did he turn to the empty soda vat and drag a small cauldron out of his storage ring. It was time to imbue his soda with healing properties. The few potions classes he'd attended had given him a basic understanding of what it took to create a simple healing potion, and these herbs from the farms were one of the most important components of the most basic healing potion. The herbs themselves had a low concentration of impurities, as expected from the strict standards of the empire, but Rhys had other intentions. He drew out a small quantity of impurities and imbued them directly into the herbs, deliberately lowering the herbs' quality. He could have added them at any time, but imbuing them into the finished potions would be suspicious if a skilled alchemist picked apart the soda, as he was sure the empire would eventually do. After all, impurities didn't just appear in potions, apropos of nothing. They were introduced by something, for example, subpar ingredients. This way, there was absolutely no proof that he was deliberately poisoning the empire. Instead, it looked as though he'd simply cut costs and used low-quality ingredients. The fact that it also helped obfuscate the origin of the herbs didn't hurt. After all, who would deliberately lower the quality of the herbs they'd stolen, except for a madman like Rhys? After his efforts with consolidating impurities, making a basic healing potion was the opposite of difficult for Rhys. He finished it up and took a sip, then made a face. Bitter. A second later, he swirled it in his mouth, trying the flavor again. It was bitter, but so was citrus juice. If he used the sugar, sweet, and flavor components of citrus and mixed them in with this bitter liquid, would that mitigate the bitterness and disguise it into a kind of artificial lemony flavor? It wasn't unheard of. Back home, if you wanted a watermelon-flavored sweet, use pear juice. If you wanted cherry flavor, use pomegranate. Once people discovered artificial colors and flavors, it only got even more complex. One didn't need the actual juice in order to simulate the flavor. In fact, in some cases, the actual juice only got in the way. Watermelon, for example, was too watery and sweet, with none of the tang the melon flesh held, while pear juice had sweetness and tang, whereas cherry juice had an unpleasant muskiness to it that wasn't present in fresh cherries, while pomegranate juice remained clear and pure. If he wanted citrus soda, he in no way needed citrus juice. It was nice to have, but not a requirement. Rather, he simply needed to figure out a chemical way to mimic the shape of the citrus flavonoid, or, well, put together a bunch of flavors until he got the sweet bitter tangy flavor of citrus. He poured the potion into the vat, then turned to fetch Lyra, only to hear a strange shriek from the other room. Rhys froze. The other room, completely devoid of life, with all the mages upstairs. He extended his mana, but still felt nothing. Despite himself, a chill ran down his spine. Was there something to the old man's warning after all? A curse? He grinned. Oh, I hope so. Rhys held his breath and pulled his aura in. Stepping quietly over the floor, with the help of some decrepit floorboards he'd insisted Orlin not fix and trash step, he approached the other room. The shriek was quiet, only loud enough that his enhanced ears heard it, and muffled, as though it came from beneath the building, though, to his knowledge, the building had no basement. His heart beat faster in excitement. Was it a ghost? Ghosts were pests, weren't they? And besides, they came out when a human died. They could be considered a human byproduct, and therefore, trash. And curses he'd already established as trash, so if the ghost happened to be paired with a curse, even better. He crept closer, peeking out into the next room. He didn't want to scare his precious guest away. There was a creak, then a long, slow groan. The room laid in shadows, and it was darker with its windows drawn than it would be usually. He had to utilize his enhanced mage vision to see it all. The room looked the same as it ever did, for all that, nothing more than an empty tavern with rotting tables and chairs sitting out around the space. They hadn't opened the inside of the store to customers, and Orlin had been pushed to his limit fixing the building, so he'd left the furniture as it was for now. His eyes flashed from table to table. Were the tables haunted? Or maybe it was the very ground the store stood on that was cursed. Whatever it was, Reese was ready. Another creak. At last, there was motion in the room, as a panel in the center of the room swung upward of its own accord. Reese held his breath. A hidden trapdoor, opening on its own. No, could it be? Were the previous owners of the tavern killers, or maybe cannibals? Did they throw the unquiet dead into the basement, then disguise it so no one would ever discover their crimes? He licked his lips in anticipation. A mob of cannibal corpses would make a nice addition to his rat and bug swarms, though, the corpses would be the eaten people, not the cannibals. Still, even so, the corpses would surely be rife with vengeance, and therefore curse energy. In the worst case, he got curse energy, and that was still valuable. Footsteps, clanging on an unseen ladder. That wasn't very ghostly, but maybe they were corporeal ghosts, or, as others knew them, zombies. He'd met several skeletons, too. In fact, curses seemed to favor skeletal forms. It wouldn't be surprising if he was dealing with a skeleton, here. A head poked up through the floor. Reese crouched behind the wall, watching from the darkness. It swiveled, left and right. It looked very human, and his mana senses told him it felt very alive, as well, but maybe that was just part of the curse. Yeah, it was an illusion, for sure. He turned back. The coast is clear. Move, move. The hell's the rush for? A second very human voice complained. The first voice scoffed. Some idiot rented this place, so until they move out, we gotta keep it quiet. I've already called Jonah, and she'll do the usual cursed routine, but until then. Why don't we just kill 'em all in their sleep? Edgar says they're mages, and one of 'em's scary strong. He might just be a mortal old man, but he's never been wrong before. The second man laughed. What would a mortal know about mages? I say we see for ourselves. In the darkness, Reese reached for his sword. These men were no curse. If they were going to threaten his people, then he'd put them down. The first man cuffed the second man in the head. We came here to move product, not start bullshit fights. What does the boss always say? Keep your head down, stay out of the Empire's eyes, and for the gods' sake, keep your merchant's permit. The Empress doesn't look too close at our potions, as long as we don't act stupid and, I don't know, kill innocent merchants. Reese frowned. Wait, no way. He was starting to put all this together. A hidden tunnel. Potions. Not wanting the Empress to look too hard at their business. These guys were criminals of some sort, and it sounded like drug dealers. Moreover, the Empress granted them cores anyways. Wasn't this the exact situation her core manipulation was supposed to prevent? Then again, who knew? Maybe she strategically wanted certain families, clans, or worst of all, ethnic groups, to become addicted to drugs. It wasn't unheard of for a ruler to allow criminals to lurk in the background so they could weaken, create scandals in, or even entirely ruin clans and noble families the ruler disagreed with. On the other hand, assuming the best of the Empress, maybe she was just overloaded. It made sense. She had to exchange all the cores in the nation. Even with delegating her power through staves, she was still a busy woman. She couldn't take her time to deeply investigate everyone who she granted a core. Plus, who knew? Maybe it was just that a corrupt official aligned with this gang had a core-shifting staff, and the Empress just didn't bother to look into that corrupt official's justification for granting these random low-grade schmucks cores. He didn't know, but what he did know, was that there were a billion ways corruption could take place, especially in such a tightly controlled empire like the Empress. No system was perfect, and one that hinged on a single human being so heavily was bound to have tons of exceptions. A moment later, he had to suppress a snort of disbelief. He'd really been right. The old man really had been trying to warn them off this building because of some crazy plot he had in mind, or rather, was related to. This building was apparently connected to the local gang's tunnels of some sort. They had ways to sneak in and out of the city with their contraband, and this apparently linked to one of those routes. It was exactly the kind of crazy plot that'd show up in that show about 4 friends and their dog, but it wasn't too far-fetched, either. He remembered reading about crazy tunnels under borders to ferry drugs from country to country. This was just a miniature version of that, in a highly restrictive environment where it made sense to move drugs into the controlled zone of the city. He frowned. But if they were doing tunnels anyways, why not just use the sewers? Sure, the sewers stank, but they were such a convenient route into the restricted part of the city. This house didn't even lead into the restricted part of the city, so why bother? True, they could skip the checkpoints at the city's edges, but they had merchant badges, and the guards didn't always check storage rings. Maybe it's just a safe point within the city, or a halfway house, or maybe they're worried about that. Sometimes, check on the rings. He still didn't get why they wouldn't just use the sewers, but then, not everyone was as educated and high-thinking of a trash maniac as him. The sewers did stink, and they were usually full of shit, when Reese hadn't just wandered through and sucked it all up. I should go back to the sewers. Revisit the library, while I'm at it. Reese tucked the thought into the back of his mind for later and turned his attention back to the gangsters ahead of him. He wasn't going to let them use his store as a pass-through for their illicit business. The only illicit business happening in this store was his, and his alone. He was a little curious what this, Jonah, was going to do, especially if she was the one who made the store haunted. He could almost taste another curse coming his way. But first, he had to deal with these chuckleheads. The 2 men continued to whisper fight for a little longer, standing over the trap door. Reese listened for a while, extending his mana senses to make sure there was no one down the trap door, then walked forward, still moving silently. The first man looked up sharply as he closed in, and his eyes widened, but before he could shout, Reese's hand wrapped around his mouth and slammed him backward, knocking his head against the floor hard enough to knock him out. The other man jumped and reached for his weapon, only for a thunk to echo through the room. He, too, hit the floor, revealing a shivering mouse behind him, holding onto her sword with both hands. She looked at Reese. They were bad, right? Yeah, they're drug dealers. Come on, let's take care of them, he said, pushing the 2 bodies back down the trapdoor. Kill them. Reese froze. He turned to her, confusion written all over his face. Why would I waste such glorious trash? Don't you know what these criminals have? Mouse looked down, then back up at Reese. Drugs. Well, but we aren't drug dealers. Drug dealing is for the lazy and those who want to get rich. We're in it to win it. We won't take down the Empress with a little nose candy. A little, huh? Reese waved his hand. Not important. The point is, you're overlooking the most important, obvious thing these criminals have. Think about it. They have fields, growers, distribution networks, clients, hell, even secret tunnels and unthinking, fearless, stupid lackeys. In short, logistics. Mouse stared at him, lost. We aren't going to rot the empire from within by selling potato chips in one small outpost of a city. We need to reach the whole empire. In other words, scale up, build our networks, hire, develop new farms, find new workers, the whole 9 yards. Sure, we could work hard and get there eventually, or we could hijack a pre-built network, with large, functional farms and an impressive network for distribution, Reese explained. I don't know about you, but I'd rather take the easy route, yeah. Most of society considered drugs trash, even if a small portion considered them better than gold. Almost everyone could agree that drug dealers were trash. This network, wasn't it built for Reese? He almost felt bad about taking it over, except they were drug dealers, and deserved none of his sympathy. The scum of the earth, and ripe for Reese's picking. Mouse slowly nodded as she caught on. So, you're going through this tunnel. Duh. Fastest way to their boss, Reese replied, crouching. Should I go see if anyone else wants to join? Nah. I'll be enough on my own. Vetoed. Both Mouse and Reese looked up, startled, as a cold voice sounded in the hollow room. Sable stalked toward them, the white bones the only part of her visible in the gloom, so that they almost seemed to float through the shadow. She glared at Reese. I'm coming. Reese shrugged. Why not? He wasn't the only one who needed to level up. It wasn't like he was the kind of alpha Chad who thought he and only he could take on the dealers, he just thought that he wouldn't need reinforcements for such a minor task. Sure. Me too. Mouse insisted. Reese nodded. Good call. You can act as scout. With that, he hopped down into the trap door, shifting his feet at the last second so he didn't land on the dealers. Sable hopped down after him, silent and graceful as a cat, and Mouse followed with a squeak. Reese dragged the two dealers in one hand, since he wanted to ask them some questions when they woke, and they set off down the tunnel. The tunnel was a simple thing. A one-way earthen path through the earth. It had an organic edge to it, the sides rounded and soft, as if some natural effect or creature had carved through the ground. It was a far cry from the mines Reese had been imprisoned in, with their squared corners and timber reinforcements. These tunnels had no reinforcement at all, to the point Reese began to suspect that the walls had been deliberately left soft so the criminals could bring it down on an intruder's head at any moment. He swept his mana ahead of them, just in case they had planted such a booby trap, but sensed nothing. Reese put a hand to his chin. Bast had been sent off to deal with an incursion of impure beasts. The sewers were full of excrement from high-tier beasts held by the Empire. Could it be? Did the criminals, too, hold a beast, some kind of burrowing monster, and all the features of this tunnel were nothing but the convenience features associated with letting a burrowing monster create your tunnel network? Hold on, could that be why it ends at that random house near the gate, instead of inside the gate? Reese considered for a second, then waved his hand. He could ask the criminals that when they woke up. For now, he simply sped up a little bit, excited to finally see these magical beasts he'd heard so much about. Magical beasts. They were a staple of magic worlds, and yet, he'd seen none so far, barring a certain tuxedo cat, but as could turn into a man, and he wasn't sure the cat counted as a beast in the first place. He was a cat, after all, a domestic house cat, not a tiger or a lion. Beast just didn't feel right when applied to something so tiny and adorable. They marched on through the tunnels in silence. At last, one of the criminals in Reese's grasp shifted, coming awake. Reese gestured to the girls and sat the criminal up against the wall, crouching down to be eye level with him when he awoke. He put on a big grin and waited, deeply anticipating this moment. The time had come. It was time to act like a trashy villain. Jay blinked awake, lost. He looked around him, dazed. He'd been in the safe house, so why was he back in the tunnels? Had he blacked out again? Another digging accident, maybe. He started to stand up. That fucking overgrown rat. A gentle but firm hand pressed him back to the ground. Jay fought against it, but he might as well have fought a steel beam. He jerked back, suddenly far more awake. His vision cleared, revealing that it wasn't Nant before him, but some kid he'd never seen before with a maniacal grin on his face. The kid smelled a bit funny, but more than that, he exuded an indescribably terrifying aura, something toxic and oppressive and chilling like a curse, that left Jay feeling as though a slimy, filthy piece of trash held his shoulder in place, rather than a clean hand. His eyes jumped over the boy's shoulder, to a girl who looked like death itself, clad in the bones of what were doubtlessly her victims. He swallowed. This was no good. No good at all. These two were scarier than anything Jano had in her arsenal. No, they might even be scarier than the boss. A timid cough came from empty air to the other side of the boy, and he jerked, startling as he realized a second girl was here as well. A tiny, mousy thing that had somehow slipped his notice, despite standing right in front of him. She cringed where she stood, as if she wanted nothing more than to vanish, but he recognized that empty aura around her. That belonged to only the most successful assassins, who learned how to entirely cancel their presence. Of the three people before him, she might be the most terrifying of all. Jay swallowed yet again. I'm fucked. Reese let the man stew in silence for a few beats, then finally opened his mouth. Good morning, sunshine. If you cooperate, we won't have to be boss, I'll take you directly to the boss. The man burst out without hesitating. Reese blinked, taken aback. He looked at the man, then over his shoulder at the girls. Were the three of them really so intimidating? Sable, sure, but him and Mouse. A moment later, he cleared his throat. No point looking a gift horse in the mouth. Sure, this was probably a trap of some kind, but this man was no higher than Tier 1. He posed no threat to anyone here. His boss was probably the only one who could put up a fight against the three of them, and honestly. Reese relished the challenge. Still beaming, he thumped the man on the shoulder. Up and at him. We've got a long night ahead of us, and a boss to visit. The man jumped to his feet. He looked around, then spotted the other man lying nearby. Without a word, he ran over and slung the man over his shoulders, then gestured for Reese and his party to follow. Right this way, sir and ma'ams. Reese didn't need the man to lead him down the one-way, straight tunnel, but he didn't stop the man. If he wanted to lead, then Reese would follow. He kept his hand on a weapon in case the man tried some kind of funny business, ready to attack or defend. Behind him, Mouse scuttled silently, and Sable strutted, her bone armor quietly clattering as it swayed. The man started to jog, and they all took off, easily keeping up with them. If he'd had any thoughts of escaping, they were banished when he peered over his shoulder and saw them following him, not a drop of sweat on their foreheads. The tunnel came to an end, and they stepped out into the forest. Pale moonlight silvered the leaves and lit the grasses and sleeping flowers in thin white light. The man jogged on, heading confidently into the forest. Now that there were directions they could go, and alternate routes to take, Reese actively swept his mana senses all around him as he went, searching for anything and everything. A few times, he reached out and absorbed some cache of trash as they passed it, the remains of someone's picnic or the scraps of a carcass from a hunt. Ahead, the man took a sharp left turn. Reese's senses alerted, and he jumped forward and grabbed the man by the shoulder. Not that way, friend. Unless you intend to fall into a pit. He could sense it, just up ahead. The pit was full of blades, each of them dripping with powerful poison, enough to badly injure, if not harm, a Tier 2 mage. The pit wasn't trash in any way, but the body in the bottom of it was, and the poison was full of impurities, making it easy for Reese to sense. The man paled, and sweat ran even faster down his face. All right, there's another way. Wonderful. I'd hate to lose such a useful guide, Reese said, and left it at that. The man nodded aggressively and ran on. Reese turned toward the pit as they passed it, lifting his hand, palm up, toward it. The impurities in the poison and the body in the bottom alike lifted free of their holds and flowed toward him, the body breaking down as it flew into him. The man glanced back and caught a glimpse of the poison vanishing into Reese, and swallowed visibly. He glanced ahead of them, then gestured for Reese to follow him to the right. There's a nest of poison badgers straight ahead. We're better off going around. Wouldn't want to rile some impure beasts. Reese lifted his hand. Repeat that. There's a trap ahead. Please, I'm sorry. No. The part about impure. Impure beasts. The man asked. I thought they were a world-shattering problem. There's some right here. Reese asked, his eyes starting to glitter. They're just like mages. They can become world-shattering problems, but they start as normal beasts with some curse power and impurities, the man quickly explained, starting to sweat. They really are on the straight-ahead path. I'm not trying to double-cross you, I swear, please believe me. Excellent. Reese set off down the straight-ahead path. The dealer shuddered. Sir, I'm really telling the truth. Once those things bite, they never let go, and the venom in their fangs is enough to seriously injure a Tier 3 mage like yourself. You have too. A hand touched his shoulder. The man jumped, startled. Mouse adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. He's an impurities maniac. Just, let us there. Lead you, to the badgers. Mouse nodded. The man looked at Reese, then at Mouse, then at Sable, who stood there with a bored expression on her face and cleaned her claws. At last, with a hearty final swallow, he nodded and led them back on the first path he'd been using, toward the poison badgers. They didn't have far to go before the man stopped. Their den is just ahead. Any further, and you'll be attacked. Reese didn't need to be told, he could already sense a powerful source of impurities emanating from up ahead. Mixed with the impurities was some kind of anger, vicious and endless. He gestured for the others to stay back and progressed alone. His first encounter with impure beasts, he couldn't help but be excited. 2 pinpricks of red light appeared in the darkness. With a low bark roar, it rushed out of the ground at Reese, fangs gleaming white as it darted toward his ankles. Reese reached out his hand. He could just absorb the impurities, but he wanted to try something else. This badger was absolutely laden with impurities, filthy with them. Since that was the case, could he, maybe, manipulate them? He clenched his hand, exerting all his will toward the badger. The impurities within its body froze all at once, and it toppled over, likewise frozen as all the taint laced through its muscles, bones, and blood refused to progress toward Reese. At the same time, a huge quantity of mana rushed out of his core to fuel his usage of trash manipulation. Reese's hand shook, and his face went pale. This badger was no joke. It was only Tier 1, but holding a Tier 1 impure beast still with his trash manipulation took all he had. He didn't want to think about Tier 2 impure beasts, or beasts on his tier or higher. A technique like this simply wouldn't be possible. With the badger frozen, Reese approached cautiously. If the impurities were a part of it, then he wanted to respect that, the way he respected Sable's curse energy. But if it was infected with impurities, if impurities had been foisted upon it, then there was nothing to hesitate over. The badger laid under the moonlight, panting heavily. Its face wrinkled in pain, and its whole body was riddled with tainted streaks of discolored fur, its exposed skin strewn with raised, purple veins. It snarled as he approached, struggling against his hold, and Reese's mana took another hit. He took a deep breath, then gestured, calling the impurities out of the badger. The animal was clearly unwell and in pain. He could at least relieve its pain. The badger's breathing evened. Without any impurities in its body, Reese could no longer restrain it, but neither did he have to. The badger rose to its feet and shook its head, confused. It looked at Reese and gave him a grumpy glare, then begrudgingly nodded its head and went to wander off. Hey, not so fast. Come on, I saved your life. Don't you want to repay me? Reese pointed out. The badger growled, clearly unwilling. Reese sighed and was about to turn away, when a second pair of pinpricks glittered in the gloom. Almost faster than his eyes could catch, a second badger leapt out of the den, and lunged for the other badger, not Reese. Reese widened his eyes. It was trying to reinfect the badger he'd healed, over-attacking Reese. What a strange reaction. And on top of that, it, too, looked to be in pain, so why? There was no time for thought or questions. The badger closed in. Reese tossed out a large plank, summoning its full wall self into reality with trash intent. The second badger slammed into his hastily summoned wall and fell back, stunned. Reese gestured, calling its impurities into him as well. He hadn't noticed it with the first badger, or rather, he'd been losing so much mana keeping it restrained that it hadn't been a huge addition, but drawing the impurities out of the badger took a great deal of mana as well. He still gained more from the impurities than he lost in mana, but it was a close call for once, instead of an easy trade. It was as if the impurities were sticky, or wanted to stay in the badger. They didn't want to leave. The second badger's eyes lost their red sheen, and it slowed, looking around. It nodded at Reese in gratitude, then, seeing the other badger wander away without doing anything, cuffed it and pointed at Reese. The first badger grunted in annoyance, but reluctantly nodded. Glad to help, Reese said. It looked like they didn't want to help, so there was nothing he could do. even though the farm really could use some new hands, especially with the potential for many new farms in the near future. He sighed. Oh, well, it's not like every creature I help is going to be grateful. I should be happy to have the impurities, not looking for more. The second badger turned to Reese and barked. It started to walk toward its den, then turned around, looking over its shoulder to make sure Reese was still there. Reese nodded. I'll wait. The badger turned around and ran into its den. A moment later, it emerged, carrying a baby badger, its eyes shut, its jaws toothless, that writhed and raged in its jaws, its tiny body laced with the same veins the adult badgers had sported moments ago. Reese stared. Your children, too. He grimaced. It made sense. Impurities were things that could be bioaccumulators in his world, in other words, poisons that were spread through the womb and to the children. It was horrific to see an infant inflicted by impurities like this, but then, it did make sense. At the same time, he couldn't help but wonder, did this mean there were impure beasts who had never known what it was to be clean? These badgers had understood that they were clean, but if there were impure beasts who were born into it the way Sable had been, then in that case, the impurities would be an essential part of them. He couldn't consider all impure beasts the same. He tucked the thought to the back of his mind and bent, absorbing the impurities from the first infant. The infant stopped writhing and relaxed, instantly falling into a quiet, sound sleep. The mother badger picked it up by the scruff again and carried it back into her den, dragging out a second pup, then a third, then a fourth. By the second, her guard toward Reese was lowered, and by the fourth, she barely bothered to pick up the third and retreat with it first. When the last infant was cured, she rounded on the male badger, who was still wandering away. She chased after him and cuffed him with her claws, then bit the back of his neck, scruffed him, and dragged him back to Reese. Dropping the male badger at his feet, she looked Reese in the eye and rumbled, smacking the male badger, then nodding at Reese. Reese laughed. You're sending him with me. How about it? Are you willing to come? The male badger grumbled, but lumbered over to Reese's side and stood beside him. The female badger barked, looking at the den, then Reese. You'll come once the kids are older. I understand. Can you trace my scent? She bounced in place, indicating a yes. Good. I have some farms that need some powerful overseers, Reese said. He looked over his shoulder at the others. Come on, they're safe now. Mouse nodded, and followed after him. Sable scoffed and walked on. The dealer stared in shock, then shook his head and ran to the front of the line. Yes, this way, sir. Is there anything else you want to see on the way? Reese snorted. Was he really that intimidating? He waved his hand. That's enough. Let's head straight to your boss. Of course. Right away, sir. The man rushed on, glancing back to make sure the others were following. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. As promised, the man led them straight through the woods. They didn't even grow close enough for Reese to sense any other booby traps, which was unfortunate. They'd been an empowering experience. The badger walked along at his heel, his earlier hesitation forgotten. Now that they were traveling together, it seemed that he had accepted his fate. Was traveling together his holdup? Reese laughed quietly, but he got it. Social engagements were hard work. Back in his homeworld, he much preferred to spend all his time in his room. He probably still would here, if not for the fact that he couldn't get stronger or use magic if all he hid away all the time. That wasn't the path for him, not in this world, anyways. Ahead, Reese sensed life, heat, mana signatures, and lots of trash, thrown thoughtlessly aside and lying all around on the ground. His hand twitched, wanting to absorb it all, but he held himself back. There was no need to alarm the boss. They could have a civilized and convivial meeting, and then Reese could absorb all the camp's trash, after they came to an agreement about the dealers ceasing their production of worthless drugs and instead turning to the truly profitable market, potato farming. He turned to the criminal. You've done enough. You can stay back, now, though if a fight breaks out, and you join it, I won't. Sir is too gracious. I will never forget my debt to Sir. The criminal exclaimed, backing away. He looked like he wanted to flee, but a glare from Sable, and he instead set down his friend and sat beside him. I'll just sit here next to this tree, why don't I? Wait for your luminous self to be done. Reese snorted. Not knowing what to say, he simply nodded and walked away. He didn't really care if the criminal stayed or left, but on the other hand, the farm needed good, hardy workers, and this dealer was nothing if not hardy, given how quickly he'd woken up and how fast he moved with his unconscious friend on his shoulders. He wasn't going to turn the guy away, but if the dealer decided to hoof it, he wouldn't be too surprised. He strode forward, putting his hands behind his back and a serene smile on his face. Sable and Mouse followed, Sable at his shoulder, Mouse hanging back and cringing a bit, eyes darting back and forth. The criminal's base was simple, a series of ramshackle wooden buildings that blended into the woods, mixed with a few semi-permanent canvas tents and a large stable currently occupied by a few horses and a hardy-looking wagon. A few toughs stood up from the campfire and approached Reese, touching their weapons or cracking their knuckles in anticipation. Got lost, kid? One of them asked. Not at all. I heard of an opportunity to acquire a logistics network and put it to much better use. Is your boss around? I'd like to discuss my acquisition of your criminal society in a civil manner, Reese said evenly. Mouse cringed harder. Behind him, Sable let out an amused chuckle. She'd sensed the same thing Reese had. None of these men were above Tier 1, and the boss's mana signature wavered somewhere between Tier 2 and 3. They were no threat to her or Reese alone, let alone the two of them together with Mouse. Mouse wasn't much of a fighter, but it didn't matter when her stealth skills were as good as they were. She didn't need to fight, when all she had to do was sneak up and one-hit KO the enemy. He felt a vague pang of guilt at the memory of Bast doing exactly that repeatedly to poor Mouse, but put it to the back of his mind. That was just proof of how good the technique was. The thugs met one another's eyes. The biggest of them chuckled, taking the lead, his smile showing off his missing teeth. I don't think ya understand what's gonna go on, air. Do I not? Illuminate me, Reese said, unable to resist the urge to exchange some trashy pre-fight dialogue. Nah, I'm gonna crack her head, then that pretty girl's head, and if there's anyone else here, I'm gonna crack their head open, too, he declared. You're certainly welcome to try. And when you fail, you're welcome to bring us to your boss. Reese drew his broken sword. If there's anyone left, that is. At the sight of his broken sword, the thugs exchanged a look and chuckled. The lead one shook his head and advanced. This is gonna be fun. For one of us, certainly, Reese agreed. He looked at Sable. Don't kill them. She nodded. Dirt burst up behind him as he charged the thugs. White flashed alongside him as Sable lunged in as well. The thugs rushed to meet them, but none of them could match up to his or Sable's speed. There was a blur of violence, Reese's glowing trash intent matched by Sable's shining white bones, and all the thugs were laid out on the floor, bruised, bloodied, and groaning. Reese had avoided killing any of them. The farm needed workers, after all, and these men looked big and strong, perfect for potato farming. They were probably already farming, so he might as well point them at the right kind of farming, right? He pointed his sword at the man who'd challenged them in the first place. I'll say it again. Where's your boss? The man spat blood defiantly at Reese. Kill me. I'm dead anyways, since you beat me. Reese snorted. Nah, you're my all-important farm labor. You're staying alive whether you like it or not. Confusion and shock spread over the man's face. He looked Reese over, then slowly laid back down, exhausted. I won't tell you. Find him yourself. Reese shrugged and turned to the rest of the crowd. Anyone else wanna help? I won't leave until I get my answer. One of the other guards glanced left and right, then raised his hand. He's right over there, in the big building. Fucking Gion. God's damned coward, the defiant man grumbled. Reese saluted the man. Appreciated. All of you, stay healthy. I'll need my hardy farm workers when I'm done negotiating with my new subordinate. The defiant man looked over. He squinted. Jay. Not you, too. Jay laughed. I want no part of this battle. I'll pledge allegiance to whoever wins that battle. The door to the largest building flew open as Reese approached. A stringy man with a bulging potbelly swaggered out, hands on the swords bristling from his wide belt. He squinted around at the men on the ground, bruised and battered, then glared at Reese and Sable. "You the ones beaten up my men?" Reese smiled. "One and the same. Tryin' to take over my operation. I sure am, but probably not the way you're imagining." The man drew one of his swords. Jewels encrusted its handle, and a gold dragon curled over its hilt, spread wings acting as a handguard. He brandished the sword at Reese. "You'll find me a harder target than you imagined. I am, the Logan Waters." With a flourish, he unleashed his aura. A Tier 2 aura struck Reese and Sable, unusually hot and powerful for Tier 2. Reese looked at Sable. "Who's Logan Waters?" "Don't ask me," she replied. Logan looked from one to the other, shocked. "You've never heard of me." "The escapades of the notorious bandit, Logan Waters. The man who stole the Crimson Flare orb." Reese shook his head. "Sorry, nothing doing. Never heard of you." Logan harumphed. He brandished his sword again. This time, as he spun it, fire sprung up on its blade. "Let me show you the power of the man who's mastered the Crimson Flare orb." "It doesn't look very mastered," Reese said, eyeing the man's potbelly. He could sense it, now that the man had drawn attention to it. His potbelly sang with an enormous orb of fire mana, far outcrying his somewhat pitiful core. In fact, Logan was actually only Tier 1, it was just that he could bring out the power of the Crimson Flare orb to the Tier 2 level, and that was what gave him the illusion of possessing a Tier 2 mage hood. He looked at Sable. "Can you handle this?" She laughed, stepping forward. An ominous aura burst out around her. Reese touched her shoulder, asking her to wait a moment. "His potbelly is actually—" "I know," she said dismissively. Reese raised his brows, then sighed. If he could sense it, then of course Sable could sense it, too. He was the one who'd forgotten his trash tier talent in everything that wasn't trash. Sensing other mages was a valuable skill, so naturally, his ability was lower than average. He released Sable, letting her continue walking forward. Logan chuckled, shaking his head at the approaching Sable. "Should have listened to him. I'm out of your league, girly." Sable flexed her 6 bony limbs. All the other bones on her body shuddered and shifted bizarrely, moving of their own volition. Her claws flexed, and her eyes narrowed. "That's my line." In the background, Reese punched the air. "Hell yeah. One of the best lines in trashy books. Can't think of a comeback. Just hit him with the anime equivalent of, 'I am rubber and you are glue.'" It was the ultimate kindergarten argument, upgraded for the coolest of cool guys and the most awesome of dark anti-heroes, and he was here for it. Logan snorted and pointed his sword at Reese. "You won't be so jubilant in a moment when I roast this pretty thing on the bone. Now come here, darling. Let's get this over with." Sable needed no more invitation. Her eyes flashed, blazing with a hint of the red light Reese had seen in the badger's eyes. Logan slashed at her, and his sword burned through her head and into the chest of her afterimage. He whirled in time to see 3 bony limbs surging his head, and slashed the air in response. A raging hot fireball spun from the tip of his sword and closed in on Sable's face. The bones of her headdress trembled, then grew to several times their normal size, closing around her features. The fireball slammed into the bone helmet harmlessly, leaving behind naught but a scorch mark on the bones. Logan, who'd expected to see Sable retreat, stared in shock as she continued to press the offense instead. Bony limbs whirled at him from the left and right, while she clawed at him with her hands and feet. His sword moved at speed, barely parrying the barrage of blows, but he couldn't block all of them. One after another, attacks got through, sneaking past his defenses and wearing him down with cuts and slashes. Logan shouted, and opened his mouth wide. Power built up in his jaws. Reese expected Sable to jump away, but she stood still instead, continuing to hammer at Logan as though she hadn't noticed. He frowned, then caught sight of her tail, stuck into the ground behind her. She'd anchored herself. But why? The power built. Scorching heat radiated off Logan, to the point Reese could feel it where he stood. He called forth a few pieces of trash and put them between him and the battle, prepared for a cataclysmic blow. Surely Sable was confident in her plan, but why wasn't she escaping? Surely she didn't think she could take this blow. Hell, Reese was pretty sure it would badly injure him at Tier 3 if he took it head-on. I thought Sable was a quick and agile kind of fighter. Why's she just standing here to take this? The power in Logan's mouth built to a fever pitch. He reared back, preparing to launch his fire breath. Reese held his breath, leaning forward. If he had to jump in, he would, but surely Sable knew what she was doing. Surely. Just as Logan leaned forward to spit fire, the earth erupted behind him. A flash of bony white shot out of the soil and pierced through the back of his head, bursting out his eye socket. He pitched where he stood and bucked back, his mouth full of flame shooting harmlessly into the sky as Sable manipulated her tail to point his head upward. She hadn't anchored herself by sending her tail into the earth, she'd used it to sneak around behind Logan and attack him from behind. Reese nodded, finally understanding. He breathed out, quietly relieved. He'd trusted Sable, but still, that had been frightening to watch. Logan bucked as he bled out, kicking against the bony appendage that speared through him. His remaining eye dimmed, and he finally slumped to the floor. Sable retracted her tail with a derisive yank, splashing blood and dirt as she freed it from Logan's body and the earth alike. Not wasting any time, she knelt and used the blade side of her tail's end to slash open the man's potbelly. The crimson flare orb rolled out, and she picked it up and carried it over to Reese. Reese nodded at her, palming the orb, then holding it up for all to see. It was beautiful, in a gristly kind of way. Past the blood that streaked its surface, its interior was a raging ball of endless fire, as if the glass orb encapsulated the heart of a bonfire, or a very tiny star. He smiled at the thugs. Negotiations with your boss have failed, so we're progressing to the hostile takeover part of our plan. Would anyone else like to resist? I promise you, working under me will be no more troublesome, or illegal, than working under Logan poorly surnamed Waters. Should have called himself Logan Fires, honestly. The thugs glanced among one another. At last, the defiant one clambered back to his feet, groaning and aching the whole way. He nodded at Reese. The Waters family lead the most powerful crime syndicate in this area. We'd be fools to take your hand. Oh, do they? Awesome. Point them at me, and I'll take care of the problems. It's a boss's job to take on risk for his employees, Reese declared, thumping his chest. He didn't really mind a fight, and Logan hadn't exactly impressed him. Sable had basically played with him, and still easily slain him. He was sure the upper echelons got more powerful, but, well, there was a big power gap between Logan and himself, and he was pretty sure he could handle anything the Waters family threw at him. Besides, his eyes glittered, and he smiled. He wanted logistics, farms, the whole 9 yards. If he merely took down one small gang, that was whatever. But to find out that the small gang was led by a larger crime syndicate. It was everything he'd hoped for and more. He needed to get stronger, so why not smash a crime syndicate and take it over while honing his own strength in battle? He could always fall back on trashy impurity-based techniques if he couldn't win, and, at the very least, throw his attackers off for long enough to escape. If he took Lyra, Sable, and Mouse with him, he could strengthen his most powerful allies at the same time. It was a win-win situation, and even in the case he lost, he could escape and recover. Truly ideal. Rather than a threat against him, he was a threat against this crime syndicate. Reese grinned. This was his kind of hostile takeover. The thugs glanced among one another. The leader stepped forward. We can't defy you, but if we remain here, the syndicate will burn us to the ground. If you must take us alive, then you have to relocate us. Reasonable enough. Mages in this world did seem rather zero-sum, scorched earth kinds of people. Reese thought for a moment. He didn't want to take these people to his original farm for several reasons. The chance of betrayal, the risk the syndicate would find his farm, even the chance they'd simply alert the Empire, if they figured out he was more than just a hostile criminal group, and actually part of an insurrection. No, that was no good. But there was plenty of undeveloped land nearby, so he nodded firmly and gestured. Bring everything you need for farming and distribution, and come with me. Long term, he'd simply overtake the entire syndicate, and acquire their fields and buildings as well as their workers, but for now, he needed to make sure they didn't try to send him a message by massacring his hard-won workers. With that in mind, he turned to Sable. Can you tear this place up a bit, spread some of his, he gestured at Logan, blood around the place, so it looks like I killed everyone at a glance. She nodded, unbothered, and turned to her grisly task. Reese gestured to the workers and Mouse, and he led them across the land, away from the city and their camp and tunnel alike. Out in the boonies, not far from the impure well where he'd found Sable, he left the criminals, setting them to the task of clearing the land and preparing it for cultivation. With them set to task, he headed back to the tunnel. Sable was waiting for him there. He looked up at the tunnel, thinking. This was a valuable entrance and exit from the city, but if the crime syndicate knew about it, wasn't it simply asking for them to come through it and attack them? He pinched his chin. On the other hand, if he collapsed the tunnel, that was the same as admitting that the people on the other end of the tunnel were responsible for the destruction of the camp, but closing off their chance for retribution. It would force the criminals to find another way to attack them, whereas, if he left it open, he knew where the criminals would attack from. He could basically expect that the criminals would figure out that they were the ones who'd attacked the camp. He'd left too many hints, including the two criminals who knew exactly who'd attacked them, and where. But leaving it wide open, he nodded. Better to invite them into a place where he could battle them without the Empire taking too much notice, rather than to let them choose the avenue of attack, and risk the Empire poking around at his snack shop. Leaving the tunnel open didn't guarantee they'd attack him from it, but the criminals also had to hide from the Empire, so they both benefited from a discreet battle rather than open war. He looked at Mouse and Sable. We can expect an attack through this tunnel in the near future. Would one of, or both of, you like to guard it? Sable laughed darkly. I'm better suited to battle than cooking. Leave me in the darkness. If I need help, I'll send a pulse of mana. Send one whether you need help or not. I want to know if they attack, and who, and where from. I'd rather attack than be attacked. Once we know enough, we can launch a counterattack, but if you just quietly kill them all, we'll never be able to return fire. I understand, Sable said, nodding. We want to absorb them into us, as farming subcontractors, basically, and distributors. Once we have franchisees, we'll need to have a supply chain in order, and better if we have the supply chain before we have franchises, Reese explained. Franchises? Mouse asked. True evil, and a way to make even more money than the snack shack, Reese said. They'd see when they reached that point. Until then, it was too much to explain. Mouse nodded, a little hesitant, but said nothing else. You two head back. I have one last errand to run, Reese said, nodding at the badger. The badger looked up at him and huffed, as if to ask, how much further do we have to go? Mouse and Sable vanished into the tunnel. Reese held his hands out to the badger, offering to pick it up. The mammal gave him an exhausted look, deeply considering, then sighed and shifted, letting him pick it up. Reese scooped it into his arms and took off, speeding into the forest. He headed off, not toward the criminals, not toward his trash heap hideout, but toward Purple Dawn. He set the badger down right in front of the raccoon, who looked at the badger, then up at Reese, and spread its hands. He could almost hear its voice. What am I supposed to do with this? Raccoon, meet badger, badger, raccoon. I'm going to need you to take on more workers, because we're about to expand in a big way. Multiple farms kind of big. This guy's pretty tough, and you're going to need new overseers soon, the kind who can keep the littler guys in line when you aren't around. Think he's a good candidate? Reese asked. The badger gave him a long-suffering look, then huffed, turning to the raccoon. The raccoon looked it over, top to bottom, then nodded appraising Ly. It gestured for the badger to follow him. The badger lumbered away, grunting under its breath. Reese watched them go, nodding in satisfaction. To be honest, he preferred to use animal workers, it was just that he didn't know the extent to which the raccoon could expand its underlings in a short time. If it could, then he didn't have to hold back as much on killing the thugs, and consequently, didn't have to worry about betrayal from unwilling human workers strongarmed from drug work into potato work. But he couldn't rely on an untested capability, so he was building both in parallel. The raccoon could work on expanding its workers, while Reese gathered humans, and he would see which one became mature first, then lean into that route. Personally, he hoped it was the animals, but the humans were cheap, easy labor. Since he was in the area, he absorbed the impurities from the rats and other animals before he left, and took a fresh load of potatoes back to the shack, utilizing the tunnel to return. As long as they were going to leave it open, he might as well use the tunnel himself. As he walked, he heard the faint clattering of bones overhead, and looked up to find the pale outline of a bony figure on the ceiling. "Hey, Sable," he said. "More potatoes?" she asked. Reese shrugged. "Gotta feed the fry addicts, what can I say? All for the downfall of the Empire." Sable chuckled, and clattered off. Back in the snack shack, he tossed the potatoes down and returned to his soda experiment. He tossed the potion into the water, mixing it up, then tried it again. It wasn't too bad, honestly, it tasted about as bitter as unsweetened soda water did. Of course, he'd be making it carbonated yet, which would add a bit of bitterness as the carbonic acid formed between the water and the carbon dioxide, but he should be able to mask the displeasing edge to the bitterness with some citrus juice and the most important ingredient, heaps of sugar. I need to look into growing some sugar beets. Even on his homeworld, the primary source of sugar wasn't sugar cane, as some people supposed, but beets. Sugar beets, burned with bones to purify out their sugar. Refining sugar was a little more involved than frying potatoes, but he'd done some outright alchemy, so it was nothing outside of his ability to accomplish. He'd have to purchase sugar otherwise, and given that it was a somewhat involved process to refine it, it'd be a costlier ingredient to procure than potatoes. If he wasn't already a potato farmer, he would have prioritized sugar beets, since potatoes were relatively cheap to procure, but as it was, he could always turn around and pick up sugar beets now that he'd established his snack shack, to fuel the most expensive portion of his soda production. The night passed by. Reese tinkered with his soda and dreamed of sugar beets, waiting for the first light of dawn to launch once more into snack shack madness, all while the criminal underbelly slowly discovered what he'd done. Business continued to flow freely. Potatoes flowed out, fried into delicious golden chips and fries, and gold flowed in. A few days passed. Reese checked on the raccoon's farm and watched as the raccoon grew the next generation of farmers, and swung out a few times to make sure the ex-criminals got to work putting their powers to good use, producing potatoes, tomatoes, and continuing to set up Reese's second farm. Reese poked around in town, looking for someone selling sugar beets or sugar beet seeds, but there wasn't much of an agriculture market in this city, as developed as it was, not to mention that most mages weren't overly interested in agriculture, since they didn't have to eat. He wanted to head out into the surrounding rural areas, talk to some mortals, and source himself some seeds, but with the criminals hanging over his head, he couldn't leave the shack unattended. He was the sole Tier 3 in their arsenal, and as competent as Sable and Lyra were, they weren't Tier 3, if a Tier 3 or worse, 4, showed up, he'd be the only one who could stand a chance against them. Sable hung out in the tunnel. Reese always paused to exchange a few words when he passed, to make sure she didn't get bored, but honestly, she seemed happy with her seclusion in the dark. He didn't know what kind of monster her father was, but given Sable's limbs and tail, he seemed likely to be some kind of bug-based monster, maybe a scorpion. Scorpions liked the dark and hiding under stones, so maybe Sable shared that proclivity. He didn't know, but she seemed happy, so he wasn't going to force her out of her happy place. Not when it also helped him out. The crimson flare orb wasn't much use to him offensively, given his low affinity with fire and fire-based techniques. He offered it to the other mages, but none of them were interested. Mouse took a good look at it and finally explained that it was an orb meant to be slotted into a larger armament, basically, a mana battery for fire elemental mana. It had high power output, as he'd seen, but took a great deal of time to get going, as he'd also seen, which meant that even though it allowed a Tier 1 mage to access Tier 2 fire spells, realistically, it couldn't be used in combat by a single mage, since it took too long to heat up and fire, as he'd seen in Logan and Sable's battle. As a mana battery powering some kind of city defense level armament, it was perfectly acceptable. After all, it was the kind of weapon that could be fired at an enemy army from 100 miles out by some grunt with little training. Still, what made it useful for long-ranged city-level conflict made it not too much use to a mage engaging in one-on-one combat, since a real Tier 2 mage could easily dispatch a Tier 1 mage faking Tier 2 with such a clumsy orb. Looking back on it, he recalled Logan bragging about his prowess and his orb. Had it all been a bluff, meant to dissuade him and Sable from attacking? He pursed his lips. A weaker or more cowardly Tier 2 mage might have been scared off, but he was Tier 3, and Sable was a high-class, aggressive Tier 2 mage who didn't hesitate to charge into any battle. It had been a poor misread of his opponents, when what he should have done was stall for time to charge up the orb, though thinking back, he'd bought himself some time chatting with Sable, hadn't he? Ultimately, Reese had to concede that Logan had played his orb perfectly. Logan's real mistake was that he was using trashy tactics against opponents who were even trashier, who weren't playing mind games or three-dimensional chess, but instead the simplest, trashiest game of all, raw might. At the end of the day, they'd won, Logan had lost, and now he had an orb of fire no one wanted, that he had to figure out how to utilize. With no better use for the orb, he chucked it under one of his oil pots, where it became a convenient, easily configurable, and highly regular source of heat, so he immediately put one of the more enchanting and engineering-inclined mages to work manufacturing a series of heat coils to distribute the heat from the orb evenly across all the vats that required heat. It was nice to not have to run around searching for fuel or powering the fire with his own mana, too, so that was an added bonus. He was standing in the kitchen, chopping potatoes for chips, when an urgent pulse of mana rushed to him from Sable's location. Reese dropped his knife and ran, and Lyra, who'd been appraised of the situation, chased after him. They were still using a stand out front instead of inviting guests into the store, due to the furniture's run-down nature and the potential of criminal incursions, so there was no one to worry about when he ripped open the trap door and dropped into the tunnel. Lyra followed after him, splashing down in a self-made puddle. They ran along the tunnel, toward Sable's mana pulse. The sounds of fierce battle echoed along the tunnel the second they stepped inside, growing louder with every passing second. Around a turn, and the fight came into view. Sable clashed with a group of battle-scarred men. The majority of them were Tier 1 or so, but hanging in the back, one of the men emanated a powerful Tier 2 aura, at the upper limits of the tier, if not on the verge of breaking into Tier 3. There was a bored expression on his face, but as Reese and Lyra appeared, his expression brightened. Over Sable and the underlings, battle, he pointed at the two of them, no, at Reese. Finally, a warrior worthy of my intervention. Lloyd Waters, at your service. I think Sable's worthy enough of your intervention, Reese countered. Someone so easily bogged down by my underlings isn't worthy of my blade. I take it you're the one who killed my younger brother. Reese blinked. Logan Waters had been in his 40s, easily, with the receding hairline and pot belly to match. Lloyd, on the other hand, looked in his mid, maybe early 30s, not quite youthful but with the strength and vigor of a man in his prime. Between the two of them, he would have called Lloyd the younger and Logan the elder, but that was using mortal logic, not mage logic. Lloyd appearing younger just meant the man was more skilled, and able to freeze his age younger. He waved his hand, pushing his extraneous thoughts aside. No, that was Sable, actually, but if it's a fight you want, I'm happy to provide. It's been too long since I last fought. Then she's the leader? Lloyd asked, giving Sable a doubting look. No reason why she couldn't be, but if you were being strict about it, I'm the leader. By the way, how many brothers do you have? Reese asked. 3, now that you've killed Logan. Reese nodded, spinning his broken blade casually. So I only have to kill 4 more of you before I can face the big bosses. Good to know. Lloyd's face turned dark. He drew his sword and held it out in one end, pointing its tip toward Reese as if he could stab Reese from where he stood. Even though the men were between them, Sable and the underlings, Fight taking up all the space in the tunnel, sharp killing intent reached Reese. You'll die for underestimating me. Underestimate, nothing. It's simple math. Or do you not understand math? I thought drug dealers were at least capable of algebra. You think we're mere drug dealers? Lloyd asked. Reese spread his hands. Yeah, what else do you do? Murder for hire. Human trafficking. I'm not going to be impressed, but it'll help me justify slaughtering you. They were bad guy words, but he was in his villain era, so it felt right. As he spoke, Reese breathed out a plume of invisible toxic air from the trash fire burning inside him. Using trash manipulation, he kept the toxic gas compressed into a tight ball, then sent it flying toward Lloyd. Trash manipulation struggled to handle a mass of gas. It took an immense amount of concentration on Reese's part, but he kept it wrapped up tight and slowly floated it toward Lloyd, over the ongoing battle and past Sable and the underlings. Lloyd laughed. We're the premier criminal syndicate in the Empire. There's nothing that we can't accomplish. If this is all the better the Empire's criminals get, then, damn, I guess the Empress's anti-crime techniques really are effective, Reese said, shaking his head. The trash gas bobbled along. All it wanted to do was flee upward and disperse. It took every ounce of Reese's will to keep it compressed. In a battle, he'd completely be unable to concentrate long enough to use this technique, but in an exchange of trash talk, he had plenty of mental power to spare. Lloyd narrowed his eyes. His grip on his sword tightened. You won't be saying that when you meet my older siblings. But I can sure say it when I meet you. The invisible ball of gas finally floated over to Lloyd, and Reese released it, or at least loosened his hold. It burst from a tiny compressed ball of dense poison into a big amorphous cloud of poison that fell over Lloyd. To be honest, Reese had no idea how powerful this gas was, or how useful this attack was going to be. He just wanted to use Lloyd's little brother Logan's delayed tactics against Lloyd. It was a good idea, so why not give it a shot? It hadn't worked for Logan, but then, unlike Logan, he had plenty of backup plans and tactics. This was but his opening move, the first pawn shifted in chess. Lloyd stared at Reese for a second, confused why his final declaration had been so enthusiastic, until the clear gas swirled around him, sucking into his lungs and decaying his flesh where it touched his skin. He dropped his sword and staggered back, beating at his skin, but the more he touched the gas and thrashed in it, the more the gas coated his body. Lloyd screamed, tearing apart piece by piece. With his last breath, he charged Reese, but before he made it to his underlings, his body came apart and fell to the floor in a rapidly decaying pile of mush. Reese blinked. He looked at the pile of goo, then at his hands, then touched his mouth. Is my breath that bad? How was the gas staying in his core without destroying him? Especially with how his core was functionally ruined mess. His mind went back to his early days, repeatedly reforging his body in Infinite Constellation School. Back then, he'd forced his body to take all kinds of abuse and grow stronger, more capable of handling acid, trash, impurities, and everything else. He raised his brows. I guess all my hard work is paying off. He'd worked hard to hammer his body into better shape from the trash form he'd started off with, and now, it was able to handle all kinds of hideous filth. Including, apparently, the kind of intensely toxic fumes that could melt a Tier 2 mage outright. Reese clapped and turned to the underlings. They still fought with Sable, but with less vigor now that their boss had been killed in short order. If you don't want to be melted like your boss Lloyd, stop fighting. I'll spare your life if you join my team, and work on my farm instead. One of the men glanced back, distracted. Sable lashed out, disarming him. He threw his hands up and surrendered. Once one of them surrendered, the rest quickly followed. Reese dusted off his hands, pleased with a job well done, though a little uncomfortable with the puddle of filth he'd turned Lloyd into. He'd really expected that to be the first move in a salvo, not the final word in their exchange. He reached out toward it, absorbing the Lloyd soup and the remnants of the toxic gas into himself alike, then clapped and turned to the newly acquired farm workers. Lyra, would you lead them to their workplace? There's some previous thugs, farm workers there, and they can join them. He turned to the newly acquired farmers. You can ask them anything. They'll show you the ropes. And don't worry, we pay well. Lyra snorted, dissatisfied. Didn't even get to fight, and now I've got to run errands. I can walk them there if you'd rather, Rhys offered. She waved her hand. Might as well do something useful. Sorry about that. I really had no idea that was going to kill him, Rhys said apologetically. He'd really expected it to simply weaken him, as a test, and then he'd hand the fight off to Lyra to finish, but things had gone a little sideways along the way. Remind me never to let you test new techniques on me, Lyra commented. She turned to the thugs. Come on. Best get moving before he decides to use you as test subjects instead. The criminals jumped up. A few shot Rhys looks of horror, while others simply ran to Lyra's side, not even daring to look back. I'm not going to, Rhys sighed. Nothing he could do about that. He had melted their leader, and it had been an accident, but he didn't usually go around accidentally melting people. Still, given that that was all these people had seen of him, he couldn't exactly blame them for their fear, even if it was misplaced. Rhys stared into the vat, thinking. The sun was finally setting after a long day of chips and fries, and he was back at his usual efforts at refining his drink offerings. He had his soda more or less ready to go. All he needed was a steady source of sugar to sweeten it. He couldn't exactly put his soda into full production when he relied on random merchants bringing enough sugar into the city for him to continue making it. He didn't want the rush of a short-lived fad, trashy though they might be, but the long, slow, insidious infiltration of soda into the lives of every mage in the Empire. If he was going to turn this incredibly mild healing potion/soft drink into a profitable sales leader, then he needed a steady and low-cost source of sugar. After all, that was ultimately the secret of soft drinks, a steady and low-cost source of sugar, utilized to make the ultimate of delicious, cheap, and unhealthy drinks. Bzzz. A strange buzzing echoed from the yard behind the tavern. Rhys left the vat, and his thoughts, behind, and wandered out to check on the source of the sound. The backyard was a tangled mess, all weeds and trash, which he'd left there with great sadness in his heart because if he hadn't, his yard would have stood out from all the other shops, back lots. It wasn't a large area, just a small 10-foot by 5-foot space meant to be, who knew? An herb garden. A holding space for trash. In any case, the source of the buzzing noise was immediately apparent. The female mage who'd helped him clean the building stood in the small yard, focused intently on a small flock of honeybees. Her eyes were glazed yet intense in the way that told Rhys she was doing something important and magical, so he stood nearby and waited for her to finish. At last, she breathed out and blinked, then looked up, meeting his eyes. Good evening, Rhys. Good evening, Rhys abruptly realized he'd never caught her name, and cleared his throat in embarrassment. She laughed good-naturedly. Kuyi, my name is Kuyi. Kuyi. Couldn't help but notice that you're handling honeybees this afternoon. Indeed I am. Rhys stood there for a second, a little awkward and uncertain of how to broach the topic, then decided to just go for it. Could we use the bees to secure our source of sugar? I thought you'd never ask, she said, beaming. She turned to the bees. Ordinary bees couldn't keep up with our demand, not without a full-scale honey farm, but I've been working with these bees for a while now, imbuing them with mana. They can produce far more honey than the average hive, in shorter timeframes as well. The only problem is that they need nectar to create honey. Flowers. And we're in a city. Rhys grinned. That's no problem at all. We've got farms. Plenty of plants out there. Surely some of them need to be pollinated. You would allow me? Kuyi asked. Sure, why not? She shrugged. Some farmers fear what our enhanced bugs can accomplish, or worry that we might test our dangerous bugs on their crops. And to be fair, some less responsible bug mages have, in the past, caused the decimation of crops, then vanished. I suppose you have magic, so it's not as though you'd be powerless, but... Oh, yeah. Well, if you decimate my crops, I'll decimate you, Rhys joked. Kuyi bowed deeply, a serious expression on her face. I will take great care. I appreciate that you've put your trust in me, and will do everything in my power to keep that trust. No, it was Rhys pursed his lips. Right. In this world, he had the power to kill people, and not only that, but he was stronger than her, and no one seemed overly concerned about law and order. A threat to kill or harm someone wasn't funny in this world, unless their power levels were equal, or Reese was the weaker one. He rubbed the back of his head. Sorry. That was a joke. Oh. Kui looked at him, then smiled. Good. As long as you're making delicious honey, we're all good. Reese smiled awkwardly and backed away. He waved one last time, then ran for it, too embarrassed to face her again. Still, that was one problem solved. Plenty of problems still to go. Like the rest of the Water Syndicate. He didn't foresee the next sibling being much more powerful than Lloyd or Logan, but if they kept scaling up like this, eventually, they'd get real strong. And if they had two parents still surviving, or parents and grandparents, or hell, great-great-great-grandparents, or even great-great-great ad infinitum, given mage lifespans. Reese waved his hand. No way did the Water Crime Syndicate expand more than 2, maybe 3 generations. At some point, the elder mages had to stop caring about petty crime. Maybe they still cared about crime, sure, he wouldn't take that away from elder mages, but drug dealing. At the very least, they should have ascended to higher realms of drugs that were powerful enough to affect stronger mages, drugs powerful enough to outright kill mages on the level of the Empire's ordinary mage citizenry. No, he might have to prepare for grandparents, he almost certainly had to prepare for parents, but something beyond that would be ridiculous. Of course, that presupposed that the elder mages, the grandparents and so on, hadn't simply died by now. Mage lifespans weren't infinite, at least not until the higher tiers, and at tier 3, though Reese could expect to live somewhere between 2 to 500 years, he wouldn't live forever. If the grandparents of a small crime syndicate hadn't ascended past tier 3, and since they were a small crime syndicate, Reese was pretty confident they weren't geniuses at magehood. Either, their children were old enough that their eldest child was somewhere in his 40s, it wouldn't be insane to expect that the grandparents and great-grandparents and so on were simply flat-out dead. It also assumed that the grandparents had been mages at all. They could have been mortals. True, with 4 grandparents, it wasn't impossible that one of them was a mage, but it also wasn't impossible that they were all mortals. After all, who would start a small crime syndicate? A pair of mages with connections and money from their mage parents, or a desperate pair of once mortals elevated to magehood with no resources, who had to desperately scrabble for money and everything else the whole time. The latter pair seemed far more likely to resort to crime than the former to Reese, but who knew? Maybe they were a pair of bored brats who'd spawned the Water Syndicate for fun in their free time. Reese sighed. It wasn't really important, in the end. He'd find out if the Water Syndicate was backed by secret powerful elders when he got there. Actually, the more he thought about it, the more likely it sounded. How could they operate without at least one powerful backer? Still, would that powerful backer step forward if someone else stepped in and gently realigned their crime syndicate's business practices towards something yet more profitable? No, I think they might protest that, even if I wasn't killing all their children/grandchildren/great-great-grandchildren. He sighed again, then shook his head and looked around him, pulling himself out of his thoughts. After all that, all he'd decided was that they definitely did or did not have a backer, which was exactly where he'd started. At the end of the day, it didn't matter until they showed up or didn't, and there was really no point in worrying about it until it happened. He was currently in his persona as the red and yellow harlequin-suited charcoal-smeared foreigner from an unspecified foreign country, so it wasn't as though it was too dangerous to wander the city, but if some guard decided to cause problems, he could still get in trouble. It really wasn't a good idea to just run around randomly like this because he got flustered over an awkward social moment with a coworker. Still, he didn't want to go back yet. It'd be embarrassing to admit defeat and run home with his tail between his legs, and plus, it wasn't as though Kui's bees would have made soda quantities of honey in the last 10 minutes. He didn't often leave the shop, or his various hidey holes and trash pits. He might as well go see the sights, do something fun for once. Reese paused. What do I do for fun, nowadays? Back home, he usually reading. He reached into his robes and pulled out a small red book. On his sword, the straw doll charm came to life and stared up at the book it was hard to tell, with such a small face, whether it was worship, excitement, or abject horror. He moved the book back and forth, and the straw doll gazed after it with big, wide eyes, refusing to let it out of its gaze. Rhys lowered it, gazing at the unmarked cover. The little red tome had fallen out from between two books, squeezed out of view, or had it fallen out of a larger book? Or maybe it was wedged behind a row of books. I think it was that one, but it's frightening that I can't remember. It felt as if something was slowly wiping the knowledge from his brain, or maybe confusing it, mixing it together until he couldn't trust his own memories. Something didn't want him to remember where this book had come from, or was it that something didn't want him to remember the book at all? It had slipped his mind until this moment, despite him remembering, now, that he'd made several notes to himself to remember it. Either way, it only made him want to read the book even more, if something was trying to make him forget it. If they wanted him to forget it and discard it, didn't that mean this book was trash? And if this book was trash, then its knowledge was essential to him. He wandered a little further, looking for a place to pause and read, then plopped down on a low wall and dove into the tome. It was horrific reading, the absolute worst. The writers seemed to barely have a grasp on the language they wrote in, and a maddeningly awful scrawl to match. It was like picking apart a doctor's chicken scratch while reading Middle English at the same time, as if Canterbury Tales was written by Rhys's family physician who'd only today discovered fountain pens and as a result, left big blots of ink all over the pages between thin, faded text that suddenly transformed to ink so bold he struggled to make out the letters as they ran into one another. The entire thing was nothing more than the most garbage associated with any written form of any language, all heaped into one garbage book that, even when Rhys comprehended the individual words within it, didn't seem to make much sense. It wasn't even trash literature. It was just trash. Rhys furrowed his brows. He wasn't going to give up just because it was hard to read. He'd read the Canterbury Tales, all of them, even the borderline pornographic ones. He could do this. Speed reading engaged, working hard for the first time since he'd gained that skill. He read the text over and over. It was short, thankfully, even if it seemed to be nonsense. Slowly, something started to emerge from the garbage. Some deeper understanding. Something he struggled to put words to, so much so that he began to sympathize with the writer. He'd thought they were garbage at their job, but it turned out, they were simply trying to convey something that was so difficult to explain with words that the easiest way to do it was to make no sense and hope that someone in the distant future tried hard enough to understand them that they could accomplish something akin to comprehension. At last, he sat back, letting out a slow breath. The void, huh? He didn't understand it any better, and yet, he felt as though he'd inched closer to some valuable conclusion. Speed reading 14 greater than 24. He gazed up at the sun, then startled. It had been evening. How long had he been sitting here? No, forget that. How had he not noticed it growing dark, then bright again? It wasn't just morning, but, he looked up, squinting. The sun was almost dead overhead. It was almost time for lunch rush. He put the book away in his robes and rushed back to the shop, locking away his insights into the back of his mind, and made a note to keep checking in on them. He didn't want to lose this information as well to whatever eroded his memory of the book. Time passed. Their profits grew, and Rhys purchased the building outright, then started shopping for their next location. In the meantime, he had a few of his underlings build a second cart, then walk the streets with it and record their sales at each location they stopped at. The more they wandered the city, the more they learned about the best places for sales. As expected, anywhere near the mage school did well, but surprisingly, so did the areas near any gate, where the adult mages who worked day in, day out, doing gods knew what for the Empire, could stop out and grab a quick salty snack. Honey started coming in, and Rhys started selling his weak potion soda. The students took to it like flies to, well, honey, while the adults were a little more reserved to it, unused to cooled beverages or sweet potions. Rhys frowned, thinking on it, then snapped his fingers as the answer came to him in a flash. Obviously. Adults liked soda, sure, but what did they need? What did they crave more than life itself? Coffee and energy drinks. For adults, flavor was secondary, the chemical effect on the body was far more important. So, he'd plunged back into the sewers, raided the library for potion books, and popped back out to practice stamina potions, concentrating them over and over again until the other mages made him practice outside, because the fumes were too fierce for them to focus anymore, and their hands wouldn't stop shaking. Lyra, a little more delicate to water vapors as a water sprite, insisted he not get too close to her, lest she start buzzing around the building. Using the concentrated stamina potion and the weak healing potion, Rhys developed a second drink with a higher concentration of active ingredients. It was more bitter than his soda, not carbonated, and meant to be served hot, cold, or iced, just like coffee. Lyra eyed the strange, brownish fluid from a distance as he wheeled it out for its first test run. "Are you sure about that? That stuff is downright toxic." "I know. Isn't it great?" Rhys replied enthusiastically. The potion was laden with traces of impurities, of course, but even better, it was the most trashy beverage available outside of cheap beer, an energy drink. Even if his victims, patrons, didn't get too badly impurified, they would still get physically and emotionally hooked on the energy drink. Serving it in the mornings would only cement his power over them, hooking them to using it to wake themselves up. Sure, mages didn't need to sleep, but plenty did it as a luxury, and even if they didn't, conditioning their bodies to expect a surge of energy in the morning every day meant he could count on them to have a zombie phase every morning when he rescinded his drinks. It was the perfect plan. He couldn't be more excited. "I'm not sure, great, is the right word," Lyra replied, crossing her arms skeptically. "You're strengthening the enemy." Rhys winked. "Exactly. I don't get you," she muttered, and walked away. "Sable hasn't said anything," Rhys called after her. Lyra shook her head in the distance. "But I'm listening." He nodded. With Lyra and Sable watching the tunnel, one of them a little more at a distance than the other, he could safely go peddle his new wares. He could still retreat to the shop if they sent an urgent summons and get there within a few minutes, so even in the worst case that the Water Syndicate finally stopped nickel and diming them and launched an all-out attack, he wasn't too far to help. Lyra and Sable were capable fighters, and that was totally discounting Mouse and everyone else in the store. All of them together could hold against almost anything in the superior defensive formation of the bottleneck tunnel for the amount of time he would need to drop everything and run back. He really doubted that the Water Syndicate was going to stage a front-on attack, even after their first attempted attack which ended in failure. At the end of the day, the Water Syndicate was a criminal enterprise, in the Empire, where the Empress kept calm and civility with an iron fist. If they acted aggressive, they'd get slapped down, just the same as Rhys and his people would if the Empress became aware of them. It benefited both of them to keep things under wraps, underground, if you would, so he had no reason to expect anything but for them to attack through the tunnel. True, the more siblings he killed, the more likely they were to launch a more risky full frontal attack. As he slowly aggravated them more and more, Rhys pursed his lips. That was no good. He hadn't considered that angle. People driven into a corner could do crazy things, and he was inadvertently driving them into a corner. Then, maybe next time, we'd take the initiative, Rhys thought to himself. There was no reason to keep allowing the Water Syndicate to decide when and where their battles were fought. He, too, could control the time and place of battle. All he needed was a little creative questioning, and he was pretty sure he had plenty of levers to pull to make the truth come out, as it were. In fact, he could even go question one of his good farm workers, but that was a stone too far for him. Sure, he could casually ask around, but pressuring or torturing them was right out. Using a little creative aggression on a fighter in the heat of battle to coerce the location of the enemy base out of them was one thing, still reprehensible but not utterly disgusting. Attacking those who had surrendered out of nowhere. No, that was too far. Even Rhys had to draw the line somewhere, and that was where he drew his. He might be in his villain era, but he wasn't bad to the bone, and he really didn't want to do anything he couldn't proudly tell Bast about later. Now, it was true that, proudly tell Bast, wasn't much of a line, given Bast's proclivities and general lack of care about all kinds of violence, but it was still a line. And it was important to have lines in life. He thought all this as he pushed his cart along, heading out to where the fry cart was parked. The first one was still parked in front of the kitchen, but he'd moved the second to a place where lots of adult mages frequented, near the tall, featureless buildings he'd come to realize were this world's, or maybe the Empire's, version of office buildings. A few mages stood in line at the fry cart. At this hour, there weren't too many of them, but there were still more than zero, which was victory to Reese. He drew up alongside the fry cart, tossing his frontmen a smile, then started hawking his wares. Delicious coffee. Get a perk in the morning. Tired. Sleepy. Have a delicious pick-me-up in a cup. Hot or cold, it's delicious either way. Morning coffee. It wasn't coffee, and it was honestly disrespectful to coffee to call it coffee, but there was nothing he could do about that. He hadn't seen any coffee beans, and while the world was large and it had tomatoes, so it probably had coffee somewhere, it probably had them somewhere far away from here. In any case, the absence of coffee beans was actually an advantage. Some enterprising young fellow would have certainly discovered them and created some kind of potion or brew out of them if they were in the area, but since there were no coffee beans to be found, these people would be totally taken aback by the idea of an energizing drink. Well, not totally taken aback. Stamina potions were a thing, after all. His real pioneering move here wasn't developing something new, but marketing it differently. Just like a certain fruit-based technology company, he had nothing to share that other companies hadn't already developed, and the specs on his potion were honestly pretty watered down and weaker than actual stamina potions. But, just like a certain fruit-based technology company, he was selling it as something new and exciting, something that was truly groundbreaking. It was a drink, not a potion. You didn't take it when you were deficient, you took it when you wanted a boost and a refreshing sip. All he had left to do was get people hooked on the brand, then raise the price, so they were locked into drinking his not coffee and had to pay the higher price for his lower quality goods. It's not exactly like the tech world. I can't exactly lock them in, Reese knew, since with tech, one could deliberately build an entire ecosystem that deliberately didn't work with anything else, then sell it as better. Somehow, he'd never bought into that particular scam, and didn't understand why anyone did, when he was looking in from outside. With drinks, on the other hand, all he needed was for one person to unlock a formula somewhat like his and sell it at a lower price, and he'd lose a significant percentage of sales. Sure, people would still buy into the scam. People went out of their way to purchase Starbucks, after all, when all that coffee had going for it was the prestige, but he wouldn't get the same degree of lock-in one could with technology. Rather, once competition showed up, he'd have to head directly into the 1930s, and do all the competition things outlawed in his world, like, for example, taking massive losses to offer a product at an unsustainable price, knowing that once all the other businesses went bankrupt and he dominated the market, he could raise prices again to make up for it. It wasn't good for the Empire's economy, writ large, but that was just a bonus, as far as Reese was concerned. A haggard-looking mage stumbled over and handed Reese some coins. He traded them for a trash paper mug, and the man sipped it, eyes rimmed by dark bags, his face pale. As the stamina drink rushed into him, he took a deep breath. The dark bags receded some, and color came back to his face. He looked at the cup, then at Reese, and nodded in appreciation before staggering off. Reese smiled, then looked down at his hands. What was that? A skill had activated without his acknowledgement, one he had never expected to activate outward at all. Less is more. It had flared when the man had sipped the stamina potion, and Reese had briefly sensed the stamina drink growing more potent for the split second of that first sip. Less is more can activate on others. He hadn't expected that. Wait, but then, did that mean he could use less poison to inflict more damage? Fewer impurities to cause greater gunk? No, he'd already known that, but doing it without having to attack. Until now, He'd actively drank something, or actively stabbed someone, then used less is more. But this, he simply handed a man a cup, and the skill still pumped up the stamina-boosting effect of the drink. Reese rubbed his forehead as the full magnitude of this new discovery hit him. Inflicting less is more on others was incredible. He could kill with a trickle of weak poison in a cup of drink that his opponent would think was too weak to harm them, and save lives with a single swallow of potion administered close to him, without him even visibly intervening. As the next customer approached, Reese paid close attention to less is more, pasting a big smile on his face. How far could he affect them from? How much could he affect them? How well could he target this new external skill? As the mages slurped down their stamina drinks, Reese almost forgot to collect their coins, he was so focused on the activations of less is more. Almost. He still collected his gold. Gold was more important than anything else, except maybe overthrowing the Empire, and even that could be accomplished with enough gold. He was just trashy enough to know he could purchase his happiness, if by happiness he meant the downfall of the Empire. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.